Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Little Things. Although this film has often been called a 90s serial killer throwback, it actually sort of is and isn't. It was actually a screenplay that the director of this film, John Lee Hancock, who you probably know for directing things like Saving Mr. Banks and the Blind Side. And he had originally written the screenplay for Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg turned it down for being too dark. He was probably just trying to be nice because it's not a good movie. Everyone from Warren Beatty to Danny DeVito to even Clint Eastwood considered directing it at one point. It's sort of been a script that has been around and gone to major directors who considered making it at one point, but then eventually did not. So John Lee Hancock, being a director himself, decided to direct this movie and finally make this screenplay that had been considered by a lot of people. I think those people probably knew what they were doing by saying no. Now, granted, they might have done a better job. They probably would have had some rewrites, had some other writers come in, might have filmed it and directed differently, I hope. But this movie is almost sort of like an anti-crime movie or something, and not in an interesting kind of way that I think would work really well, specifically when we're talking about defunding the police, and there's a lot of questions on the authority of detectives and police in general. It's not really doing that, which would be nice. It does remind me of the 90s because this was an actual serial killer movie written in the 90s to be a 90s movie that never was a 90s movie, and then he suddenly decided to make this. I think one of the bigger things with this whole movie is like, what was the point of that? Like, I assume he thought this was a really good story, but what's the point of doing it now necessarily? Like, he's never really done that much crime stuff, or if he has, he hasn't done it in a very long time, mainly doing sports and biopics and things like this. You kind of don't understand his motivation behind wanting to do this, particularly because he does not direct this well, and it mostly reminds you of David Fincher's Seven. But if like the cinematography wasn't as interesting, honestly, the cinematography is one of the big things because this movie is shot very blandly. It's in a very professional way that like most people wouldn't argue with, but it's done in like a lot of like bigger wide shots when there could be more interesting close-ups. The casting is very off. The basic plot of this is you have Denzel Washington, who used to be a detective in LA and has moved on to another place in California, has come back to LA basically to pick up some evidence and winds up getting involved in a murder investigation with their new big detective, who's sort of the detective who replaced him, played by Rami Malek, and they're investigating a bunch of gruesome murders that they believe to be a serial killer, and they start investigating a guy played by Jared Leto. You know that Denzel Washington basically went insane. He had massive heart attacks. He ruined his marriage because of this investigation. And they tell Rami Malek, don't get involved with this guy. He's too crazy. He was too intense. It destroyed him. And then Rami Malek does start listening to his advice and starts following him and tries to chase down Jared Leto. Uses him as a mentor when he is like obviously like a really terrible mentor. The casting of this really doesn't work, and I know there's been the debate of like who's worse, Denzel or Rami Malek. Jared Leto's sort of doing his Jared Leto thing, so it's like whatever. Like, I don't like Jared Leto that much, but like he was actually like sort of appropriately cast for once because it seemed to actually work for what they were doing. But the idea of having two detectives in a movie, whether it's Seven or Training Day, another Denzel film, is you kind of have two people matched where it kind of says something like one is optimistic, one is corrupt, like in Training Day, or one is younger, one is more experienced, like in Seven. And they're two actors who are at different stages of their lives. So it's sort of like an interesting bit of casting. You can sort of say something about that dynamic they have with one another. But the way Rami Malek and Denzel Washington play this, Denzel is not doing his kind of like bigger, broader. He's an amazing actor, and Denzel is a great actor. He's one of the best actors we have in Hollywood today. He always really brings it. I think he brings it to this. He's doing more of a subtle thing, which he doesn't do in a lot of his big studio crime movies. He usually does the bigger, broader movie star Denzel. He didn't do that in this, and I actually sort of respect that. How he's playing it with Rami Malek is this sort of anti-charisma thing that it does seem like they actually came from a genuine place and actually sort of worked on, but it is just a weird charisma, and not in a good way, not in a way that says anything. Their energies don't mix in a way that like makes an interesting movie. You're just like, you just feel like you're hanging out with like these two really strange detectives, and I'm sure you could do that in a much more compelling way. I actually think like someone like Ryan Gosling would have been better in the Rami Malek role. Personally, I just didn't feel like Rami Malek is like, he's kind of not there actor-wise to go toe-to-toe with Denzel in this way. It just sort of didn't make a lot of sense in terms of doing this kind of a detective role, especially if you look at the ones in the 90s where they would have major actors. Like, think of, like, I know Silence of the Lambs, the thing that started off this whole thing, but having, you know, Jodie Foster, who is obviously had already won an Oscar. She was becoming considered a great actress of the newer era. You have Anthony Hopkins, who is a classically trained English actor, them going toe-to-toe. That's, like, acting-wise saying something. In this, it's like Rami Malek's younger, I guess. Like, it just, like, doesn't, like, they're not really different enough styles. It seemed like John Lee Hancock had this script that everyone seemed to like, but he wasn't good at casting it or understanding what to say with it, particularly like going back to a film like this, because that was a genre that was really big when I started getting into movies in the 90s. And I sort of understood the potential in this, and particularly, like, I will say the ending sort of made this film mean a bit more, although it meanders for so fucking long that you kind of lose any grip that this movie could ever have on you. And it's doing it in such a strange way that, like, it just doesn't really work. Like, I sort of get what it's doing in some cases, and there's certain interesting parts of it. Like, I've heard a lot of people talk about the No Doubt flyer that is on the dead girl's fridge in one of the scenes, and how that's like an early No Doubt flyer because this takes place in 1992. That was when, I think when they had, like, what was it, that song Trapped in the Box, or maybe it was before that, like early 90s No Doubt, before Tragic Kingdom and all that. That, like, and people were obsessing over that, and that shows you, like, that's a really interesting detail, and whoever it was, the production designer, props to you, because I've never heard people talk about a flyer on a fridge in a movie so much before. But it just doesn't really come together and doesn't have any respect for the genre. It's just like he wants to film it. Like, it's almost like he made a bad movie from the time and he didn't think about, like, the obvious comparisons to Seven, because, like, HBO Max, where I saw this, because there are no theaters open and I wouldn't go to one because of COVID right now anyway, but right under it, it's like, do you want to watch Seven? And it's like, it's almost like HBO Max is asking me, like, you should just rewatch Seven. You'll feel a lot better about yourself. The reason why Seven and Silence of the Lambs worked very well is they're very well directed. It's not just like these were cool serial killer things. It was that they were very well told, well made movies, and this is just not very well told, not very well made. It seems like it was shot very quickly. He wasn't doing a lot of, like, coverage in his scenes, and they weren't really trying to say very much with the cinematography, like, why was it shot that way. It didn't seem to have much of a perspective behind that. To really get into this movie, I do need to talk about the end, because I think it sort of tries to make some sort of a point, which I think it sort of does, but I don't want to spoil it. So if you do not want the end of Little Things spoiled for you, just know I don't think this is a very good movie. I don't think John Lee Hancock did a very good job directing it. I don't understand why people like the screenplay a lot. I know oftentimes that happens with, like, sort of January, February movies where it's like a film that was in development forever and suddenly the studio or a director decides to make it, and you kind of question, like, how this was a thing for so long. Like, why didn't they just said, ew, no, why would we ever do that? Even watching this movie and maybe getting more of its point than a lot of people who, I've seen so many reviews where they, like, missed pretty clear points, and I can understand why. You should have your research on, but I'm not calling anyone specifically, but it's because this movie is not gripping at all. It doesn't grip you. It's not very memorable. It's like sort of like a passive chill goes over you, and you don't even, like, recognize it other than, like, it killed time. And this movie just, like, kills time like crazy without making any sort of a point of what it's doing until it gets to the end. And I don't necessarily think that's enough to make this whole experience really worthwhile. Now I'm going to get into the spoilers. Specifically the ending. So my cat is purring. It's Olive. She decides to hang out with me while we shoot this one. Not sure why. She sort of watched it with me. Maybe that's why she's like. Anyway, so you watch this whole movie and you hear about the investigation from Denzel and how it drove him crazy and so forth. You know that throughout the whole film. You understand he saw two girls who were had bags over their head and were murdered, much like you saw from the girl in The Thing, and all that. You also know Denzel found another girl with those two girls off to the side. That's all you really know. You know he went crazy, all that stuff. Well, then you find out in this stunning twist when Jared Leto and Rami Malek are driving, and Jared Leto's going to take him to where the bodies are, and he keeps not finding the bodies, and you're not sure if Jared Leto is basically being what a 1990s troll was or whatever. And then Rami Malek hits Jared Leto with the shovel. He hits him with the shovel. He goes down. he dies, and Rami Malek feels awful. Denzel shows up, and we see a flashback to understand that the other third girl in his murder scene, he killed. And that's why he felt so awful about that investigation, because he fucked it up by murdering someone by accident. And now Rami Malek has done the exact same thing and killed this guy and ruined yet another investigation. And we see in Denzel's case, they basically covered it up by saying she wasn't shot, she was stabbed. And that's clearly the guilt is what got to him. And it makes you kind of question the detectives and their methods throughout this entire thing, because we never find out if Jared Leto had a body at all. To our understanding, he probably did not do it. He was just fucking with them because he liked fucking with them. He was a weird dude who liked to fuck with people. The movie never gives us any concrete evidence that he killed them. It's just that Denzel and Rami Malek very much think he did it, but we have no evidence. So in my mind, he didn't do it. And these two cops who look like they're amazing detectives, who, their bullish, crazy attitudes are so warranted and all this throughout the entire movie, you get to the end of the movie and you find out it wasn't, because they aren't good at doing their jobs. They're actually really bad at doing their jobs. They're not catching the serial killer who seems to have continued to kill people many, many times. They keep, putting it on, Jared Leto, who probably wasn't the person, or adding body counts to it, completely screwing up these investigations. This film acts like it's very, pro-police and everything like that, but this ending very much says the opposite. It says basically that these cops are, them waiting around following this one guy, this one lead, no matter what, out of some sense of ego, was total bullshit. They're not good detectives. It's basically the whole point of the thing, and it works in this sort of anti-way. I sort of, in a way, respect. I think that's kind of an interesting way to do a detective movie, is at least have the ending say, oh, guess what, these detectives you thought were maybe good or something, and everyone around them in the movies like these guys are good, are not good. They're awful people. I sort of knew that anyway, but you didn't know how awful. It sort of reminds me, I saw this movie Snitch with The Rock, and it wasn't a good movie. But then at the end, it said this thing about basically mandatory minimum sentencing, and how it basically what happened in the movie can happen in real life. And you would, if someone basically just mailed you drugs, whether you were aware of it or not, you could go to jail for a significant amount of time. And everyone in the audience was shocked and ended up actually discussing it right outside the multiplex theater, because everyone was so incensed by this. And people were talking about how this movie made an impact on them. They're really thinking about it. I even looked it up online when I got home. I was fascinated by it. But here's the thing, that movie wasn't good, but it gave you this feeling at the end that you had learned something, that you had gotten something from this experience. So it almost felt like it's worth it. But in your heart of hearts, it's not a good movie. And I like that they made sure people knew that about that important issue. I think that's actually good. But in The Little Things, it doesn't have anything like that. And it kind of makes you think that it's rhythm, it's anti-rhythm, I guess, and it's bad plotting, and it's what are these guys doing? I don't understand this thing. Almost gives it sort of a sense of meaning. It's sort of like the idea if you had a life where you did virtually nothing and someone's like, oh, well, see, it was worth it because of this one stupid thing. No, you wasted a lot of time. That's what this whole movie did. There's so many ideas in this that could be changed into something, and I can see what all those directors thought could have been done with this. I sort of get that. It's a cooler ending than probably anyone's giving it credit for, because I don't know very many detective movies that say no, these attitudes and these crazy ideas that these guys had are not good at all, which none of those serial killer films were saying at the time. So kudos to you guys. I think that's, or at least the ones I saw, didn't do that. A really deconstructionist idea in the end, but a lot of good ideas that were not properly executed. It is sort of interesting kind of thinking about how that system empowers these guys, because even, in the end, Denzel sends the guy this piece of evidence to show that oh no, Jared Leto totally did it. So here's a piece of evidence that he would have to have murdered this girl. And you find out that he mailed him that beret basically, and he had bought those berets because he found one that looked exactly like it. So just to make Rami Malek not have the guilt that Denzel has. But that kind of makes you think this is a system that will never change, basically, because these detectives will continue to fuck up and continue to mess things up. And it is I'm surprised, Johnny Lee Hancock is not the person to direct this movie, and he doesn't have the skill at doing kind of noir things. There's certain sequences that if you just had, close-ups and mediums and like cut around more, I think they could have built in a better score, which I don't think this is a great Thomas Newman score either, could have built to something. But I sort of get the very loose ideas could have been something, and I give him credit for writing something with that kind of an ending, but it doesn't make the rest of the movie good. It just doesn't. This is not a great movie. It's not even a great 90s serial killer kind of throwback, really. I wish he had a reason for making the screenplay now. And maybe that ending made him felt like he had a reason, but it just frankly was a little too late to make the experience of watching like a movie that's supposed to be sort of a noir thriller or whatever not kind of grab you. In my mind, thrillers grab you and get you into the mystery. And if I had gotten into this mystery and then, oh, shock of all shocks, this was all total bullshit, these detectives weren't good, that would have been interesting. But the whole time you're like, I hope these guys are right. Are these guys right? Like, this is weird, right? Are they right? Is this what's going on? I don't really. And then you're just thinking about nonsense, and then it turns out like, no, they were shitty all along. And you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Oh, maybe this was. No, it wasn't. It just makes you walk away and think this wasn't really worth it. But for a second, you sort of thought it was. And maybe that's as good as this movie was, is making you believe in all this like badly executed nonsense and believe that this was something when it turns out it really isn't anything at all. And he probably should have taken the advice of those other directors and gone on and directed something else. So if you have seen The Little Things and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.